In an effort to make sense of the fact that renewed economic growth has not produced stability, Albert Hirschman, whose 1970 book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, offers a model of how members of societies in crisis behave. He posited that when states fall into crisis, citizens tend to opt out or engage, depending on what they perceive their options and best interests to be. Loyalty, in turn, is the product of the interplay of these options. It is sometimes generated by a state's capacity for reform, and sometimes produced by the impossibility of exit. Based on Hirschman's model, we will explain the concepts of exit, voice, and loyalty, and how these three factors played out in different situations in Latin America, leading to an uncertain future. In the early morning of September 19, 1985, the ground beneath Mexico City shook from an earthquake that reached 8.1 on the Richter scale. The country was already in something of a ruin, with the government ill-prepared to deal with this sort of disaster, and 4 years into a deep economic crisis, with no end in sight. Mexico was not equipped to deal with this. Over 100,000 people were left homeless, and around 10,000 were killed. Entire neighborhoods were left in ruins as 412 buildings collapsed and 3,124 suffered extensive damage. The hardest hit were the great modernizing infrastructures built post-1940 Mexican state, public housing for workers and the middle class, hospitals and schools, the symbols of progress and prosperity that had been instrumental in maintaining social peace through decades of one-party rule. However, built by politically connected construction companies that used bribes to avoid close inspections, these buildings were almost never constructed with the appropriate safety guidelines and standards. During this catastrophe, the Mexican government proved utterly incapable of dealing with the crisis. Mexicans had given up on their government long before the earthquake. After several years of grinding unemployment and economic crisis, the earthquake merely cemented the end of an era in which Mexicans of all classes looked to the government for jobs, favors, and protection. Critics on the left saw this moment as an opportunity to condemn the corruptness of the forms of crony capitalism that had long dominated the region, and call for a genuine socialist reform. Those on the right called for an entirely different solution. They demanded that Latin America embrace what would later become known as the Washington Consensus, a model that called for gradual withering away of the state through privatization, deregulation, and global trade and investment. The earthquake reinforced Mexicans' sense that the state could and would no longer act as a protector, which signaled that what would gradually be the trump of the latter perspective over the former. Starting with Chile in 1973, over the course of 2 decades, almost every country in Latin America drifted to the right. The conditions that drove this shift were similar everywhere in the region. Poor economic management, government inefficiencies, widespread corruption, and spiraling foreign debt. These all produced what was known as the lost decade of the 80s. During this time, people faced underemployment, unemployment, the loss of their life savings, bankruptcy, and among the poor, hunger. This forced people to find an exit, withdraw from the relationship with the state, and migrate. Exit often comes in different forms. It could involve the migration of the rural poor, who were forced to exit the countryside and live in the city. It could also mean exiting the formal economy, moving from union jobs to the informal sector such as unlicensed shops, contraband goods, and illicit activities. Moreover, if one is able to afford it and/or is willing to take the risk, physically exiting the country is also a choice. However, exit does not necessarily have to be physical, but can be mental or emotional. For example, under communism, many could not physically exit the country, but did not want to participate in the system either. In this case, citizens exit from civic or political participations, as they were neither loyal to the party nor they were willing to voice their dissatisfaction because doing so could lead to imprisonment, exile, or even death. For those who cling to the national and local loyalties they grew up with, or those who cannot move, or simply insist that they must change the world they inhabit rather than inhabit a different world, the choice is to act and to speak out. It is an attempt to repair or improve the relationship through communication of the complaint, grievance, or proposal for change, through protest or manifestation. How in fact do you reform police agencies with long histories of human rights abuses and corruption? How do you go up against corrupt judiciary and criminal networks which, because of weapons smuggled in from the US, are often better armed than the state security agencies? How do you make more quotable, more democratic, and more stable polity out of the ruins of the 1980s? The need for a voice brought the left back to life. Shock treatments, austerity measures, and economic policies that favor the buying class acted as a catalyst for a new generation of leftist politicians. However, this new generation tended to abstain the radical economic and social agendas from the past. Moderate leftists now pursued policies that were not entirely distinct from those of the right wing. Both left and right sought to distance themselves from the undemocratic past and avoided the dogmatism of the past. This was an indication that these reformist voices signaled the death of the ideological left and right in Latin America, in favor of regimes generally concerned with providing basic services, making goods and services broadly available at relatively low costs, and fostering economic growth. Not only is there now a new form of voice coming from the government, but also from the people. The mass insurrections, the types of seemingly leaderless eruptions that in the neoliberal era have repeatedly threatened regimes of the right and the left in Latin America.
Y esta semana el mundo entero volvió los ojos hacia Venezuela. Sorprendió por un enorme y repentino estallido social que causó varios centenares de muertos. Ejemplo de orden y democracia en nuestro continente, en ese país se vio de pronto envuelto en una ola de violencia que tras varios días mantiene varios puntos sin sofocar. El desencadenante fue un paquete de medidas económicas. Esto es un shock en términos ortodoxos que posibilitará a Venezuela el acceso a un préstamo de aproximadamente 4.300 millones de dólares de parte del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Pero, ¿qué pasó realmente en Caracas esta semana? ¿Y qué puede ocurrir en los días próximos?
This was considered a form of voice, a different form of politics undertaken by those who lack the option to exit and can find no other means to make their grievances heard. They remind us that millions of people in Latin America have been left behind by globalization and have no means to make their needs known through the institutional channels in the new democracies. In order to speak, they must voice their opinions on the streets. Though these popular rebellions may seem to be spontaneous uprisings, they are actually the outcome of long histories of unresolved grievances. Mass insurrections revealed the tenuousness of state power in Latin America in a new era of instability and uncertainty. The crowd, the popular coup, and the ever-present fear of mass mobilization would emerge as one of the most important forms of voice in Latin America in the early 21st century. Attacking one's foes can have the effect of generating loyalty among one's supporters, but is rarely enough. At a certain point, charisma and promises of a better future need to be met with concrete results, or those who helped you get into power will try to push you over the brink. Thus, loyalty can be elusive. Latin America as a whole began a period of sustained economic growth in the late 1990s. Politicians on the left and right understood the risks of a heavy reliance on commodity exports. These include causing inflation, distorting local economies, and disastrous results if global demand dries up. However, they pursue these policies because they see few other alternatives. Presidents pursue mining projects in spite of promises made to their indigenous constituents. They are opted to privilege economic development and its potential to lift individuals out of extreme poverty over the more abstract imperative to save the planet, as this would provide them with a greater chance of being re-elected in the coming years.
Bajo la consigna Agua sí, oro no, pobladores de la región norandina de Cajamarca, en Perú, iniciaron un paro por tiempo indefinido de actividades contra un proyecto aurífero de la transnacional estadounidense Newmont, por considerar que atenta contra el medio ambiente. La protesta se lleva a cabo en las alturas andinas de esa región, donde alrededor de 3.000 campesinos, comuneros y miembros del Frente de Defensa Ambiental de Cajamarca denuncian que los planes de la empresa minera extranjera para explorar oro y cobre en la zona superen la eliminación de 4 fuentes de agua, entre otros impactos ambientales. El presidente del gobierno regional, Gregorio Santos, encabezó la movilización campesina que llegó a las inmediaciones de las lagunas en los terrenos del proyecto cuestionado, donde también dirigió una asamblea popular y ratificó el rechazo absoluto a la actividad minera.
The nature of these mining conflicts reminds us that the landscape of political loyalties in Latin America has shifted rather dramatically in recent years. Over the following decades, while the rights of peasants, workers, and the poor were whittled away by states that had abandoned their commitment to social welfare, indigenous rights became one of the most salient political languages in the Americas. The lost decade of the 1980s saw the emergence of newly assertive indigenous rights movements, whose leaders insisted that long histories of colonialism and discrimination justified their claims to autonomy from the nation-states within which they were embedded. 30 years ago, the suggestion that loyalty to Mother Nature might supersede loyalty to the state would have produced gales of laughter. Today, it does not seem quite too far-fetched. The dreams of an earlier era of national unity, stability, and loyalty do not quite fit in a present where loyalties proliferate. Conflicts over extractive industries play out in various settings over a long period of time. In the first instance, they pit governments wanting economic development and deep-pocketed multinationals against environmental activists and locals who want to slow or stop the projects. Once projects begin, the battle often focuses on the division of royalties, on how best to mitigate environmental and other impacts, and on efforts to deal with the forms of violence that tend to populate the margins of these projects. At this time, truths that were once hidden start to become more obvious. Outside experts begin to test the wells, and long-term health impacts of extraction on the local flora, fauna, and people become increasingly evident. The first of these global legal battles began with a lawsuit filed in New York State in 1993. Representatives of 30,000 residents of the province of Sucumbíos in Ecuador accused the Texaco Corporation of creating an environmental disaster in the region while working there between the 1960s and 1990s. They accused the company of failing to follow basic safety standards, of dumping toxic wastewater into unlined pits, of polluting the local water supply, and leaving the local soil poisonous, unsuited for agriculture. Additionally, the residents blamed the Texaco Corporation of poisoning their population, of fraudulent practices, relying on a friendly government in Ecuador to falsify the reports when they were undertaking shoddy remediation to cover up their behavior. In spite of their voices not being heard, they opted to take their claims to New York, where they believed a fair trial was more likely. This dragged on for 8 years.
Environmental degradation of the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador. 30,000 indigenous plaintiffs are suing Texaco for negligent drilling practices, resulting in the creation of a cancer death zone the size of Rhode Island.
Más de 1,000 millones de galones de agua tóxica, de agua venenosa, fueron arrojadas a los esteros, a los ríos y pantanos del sector.
Chevron has wrapped itself up in enough legal, technical arguments to prevail in the lawsuit, but I think the moral responsibility lay at their door. You don't go into people's environments where they have lived in harmony with nature and dump toxic waste.
What was once paradise now has just been left in destruction.
The total area in which Texaco polluted is about the size of the state of Rhode Island. We are suing for environmental cleanup.
The plaintiff's accusation is defamatory and not true. It's just false and wrong.
Millones de hombres y mujeres están padeciendo cáncer y están muriendo en la actualidad.
Chevron takes those kinds of allegations very seriously. There's absolutely no evidence that there's an increase in cancer.
Chevron is fighting the claim and the men who they say have made up their story for their own financial gain.
The analysis of our water and soil samples are proving that they're guilty of massive contamination.
Esto no es contaminación. Esto es una explotación industrial permitida por la ley.
So we're going down to have a little chat with the judge today. This is something you would never do in the United States. But Ecuador, you know, this is how the game is played. It's dirty.
Usted es un abogado corrupto. Usted es un abogado corrupto de Texaco.
People are fed up with corruption. They're fed up with foreign oil companies. They just had it.
Where is her cancer? In the liver. These people have been systematically poisoned.
We've sampled every stream, and it has nothing to do with oil. It has to do with poor sanitation.
This is about some of the most marginalized people on Earth. Fighting one of the most powerful companies in the world.
Texaco hizo cualquier barbaridad de cosas, Texaco responde por lo de él.
When you look at the science, they cannot really prove their case.
At this point, relatively few things are clear. We can be certain that Ecuador has a weak judiciary. It also seems clear that neither the plaintiffs nor the defendants have entirely clean hands. The current litigation is the result of shifting political climates that created opportunities for plaintiffs to wield their influence at the expense of Chevron, and that the portions of the ruling excerpted were ghostwritten by individuals associated with the plaintiffs. It is also clear that corporate power works through the law. Americans have come to believe that the U.S. court system, like their political system, has become captured by corporate interest and is no longer an impartial arbiter of the social order. Latin Americans have long believed similar things about their own political systems, though the Lago Agrio case reminds us that new actors are increasingly capturing the levels of power. The New Left, indigenous activists, and a global network of sympathizers have found new avenues to empowerment and are exploiting them in ways that terrified entrenched interests. What is definitely clear is that in times of crisis, people tend to behave in different ways depending on the circumstances. One can either choose to exit, voice their opinion, or a combination of both through loyalty, generated by a state's capacity for reform and by the impossibility of exit. It is in understanding the interplay of these three phenomena that we have the opportunity to understand the trajectory of the recent past and what that portends for an uncertain future.